She held me there, like letting go was never an option. The first time I saw her, it was one of those ordinary days that somehow turns unforgettable. I was sitting at a small corner table in the cafe I always went to, the hum of conversation and the warm smell of coffee wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. And then she appeared, effortlessly, almost like she belonged to a different world than mine, though she was right there, only a few feet away. She moved with a quiet grace, the kind of elegance that didn't demand attention but inevitably drew it. I noticed the way her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, catching the light just enough to shine, and the way she tucked it behind her ear when she focused on reading the small notebook in front of her. She laughed quietly at something she read, a sound warm and unforced, the kind of laugh that makes you unconsciously lean a little closer, hoping for a fragment of its comfort. I try to focus on my coffee, on the hum of the cafe, on anything that wasn't her presence. Impossible. Every small detail she displayed became a magnet. The subtle tilt of her head when she considered a sentence, the way her fingers drummed lightly on the notebook, the soft hum of her perfume lingering in the air as she passed by. It was intoxicating in the most human, understated way. I didn't know her, yet already I felt an inexplicable pull, like I had glimpsed something rare and worth paying attention to. Then our eyes met. Just briefly, a flicker of recognition across a crowded cafe, but enough to make my stomach tighten. There was a warmth in her gaze that felt like an invitation, a quiet acknowledgement that lingered longer than politeness should allow. I want to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I watched, silently taking in the way she carried herself, the confidence she exuded effortlessly, and yet the subtle vulnerability hidden in her eyes, the kind that made her feel achingly human. When she moved closer to order her coffee, our hands brushed for a moment as I reached for the sugar, a fleeting contact that left a spark of awareness behind. Nothing dramatic, no lightning bolt romance cliché, just a small, human touch that somehow echoed louder than any words could. The warmth of her hand against mine lingered, and I realized I would remember it long after she had walked away. Even after she left the cafe, the memory of her presence clung to me. The soft cadence of her voice, the sway of her walk, the quiet confidence and elegance that seemed to belong to another world yet existed so tangibly before me. That day, something subtle but undeniable began. A curiosity, a fascination, a quiet pull that promised more than just a passing acquaintance. And though I didn't know it yet, that single, fleeting encounter would be the first thread in a story neither of us could have anticipated. After that first fleeting meeting, it felt almost impossible not to notice her. Life has a way of weaving coincidences into something that feels intentional, and somehow, our paths seemed determined to cross. The second time I saw her, it was at the same cafe, though she didn't notice me at first. I tried to convince myself it was just coincidence, that maybe she was here for the same reason I was: coffee, routine, comfort. But the way she looked up and our eyes met again made my pulse skip in a way I wasn't expecting. This time we spoke. Just small talk at first, nothing monumental. Comments about the weather, about the way the cafe had changed its seating arrangement, about the book she had opened. But in those few sentences, I felt a connection that surprised me. It was effortless, natural, and yet beneath it lingered an unspoken current, an undercurrent of curiosity and quiet tension neither of us fully acknowledged. Every accidental brush of hands seemed amplified. She reached for the sugar packets just as I did, and our fingers touched briefly, the contact light but electric. I became acutely aware of the warmth of her skin, the subtle pulse in her wrist, and the softness of her knuckles. The ordinary action of holding a cup or passing a napkin transformed into something intimate, meaningful, charged. I realized how much I noticed. The tilt of her head when she listened, the soft crease of concentration in her brow, the way her lips curved when she smiled at something private, almost secret. Then there was the laughter, soft, contained, but real, spilling out unexpectedly when something small struck her as funny. I found myself leaning slightly closer, not on purpose. It just happened so that I could share in it, so that I could be near the warmth that seemed to radiate from her presence. There was comfort in her proximity, a sense of being quietly seen even before words were spoken. And yet, even with that comfort, there was a tension, a subtle awareness that something unspoken lingered between us. Afterward, as I walked away, I realized I was replaying every detail in my mind. The way her hair swayed when she tucked it behind her ear, the soft cadence of her voice as she spoke, the way her eyes seemed to study me, almost gently, as though assessing whether I belonged in the space she occupied. Each encounter was accidental, yes, but it was shaping something inevitable, something I couldn't ignore even if I tried. By the third encounter, it felt less like coincidence and more like inevitability. Our conversations began to stretch beyond the surface. Comments on books, shared observations about life, little insights into our worlds. We weren't rushing, weren't forcing anything. Each meeting lingered just enough, leaving a warm afterglow that I carried with me long after she was gone. And though nothing had changed overtly, I felt a slow but undeniable tension building, a pull between us that was as gentle as it was relentless, one that promised more than either of us dared to name. Even now, I remember the soft brush of her sleeve against mine, the warmth of her presence lingering in the air, and the quiet awareness that somehow, in these accidental encounters, our lives were quietly intertwining. It was subtle, it was human, and it was enough to make me start wondering how far this slow, impossible attraction could go. By the time our encounters became more frequent, I realized the world felt slightly different whenever she was around. It wasn't dramatic. There were no thunderclaps or cinematic declarations, but ordinary moments gained a warmth I hadn't noticed before. We began to seek each other out without planning it, a quiet acknowledgement that our paths had become intertwined. Coffee breaks, shared errands, brief conversations that stretched longer than they needed to. Every moment carried a subtle weight, a tension that neither of us forced but both of us felt. Our conversations deepened in ways that surprised me. She began to share little stories about her life, memories tinged with wistfulness, moments of quiet vulnerability hidden beneath her confident exterior. I listened, captivated not just by her words, but by the cadence of her voice, the way it softened at certain points, and the gentle way her hands moved as she spoke. I started opening up as well, tentatively revealing small slices of my own life that I usually kept to myself. There was an unspoken trust building between us, fragile yet undeniable, a quiet intimacy that required no grand gestures to feel significant. Physical closeness began to take shape in subtle, human ways. Our hands would brush when passing objects, shoulders would touch as we walked side by side, and I noticed the almost unconscious way she leaned slightly closer during conversations. There was a comfort in these small gestures, a silent acknowledgement that being near each other felt natural and right. I remember one afternoon when we were both reaching for the same book on a crowded shelf. Our fingers collided lightly, and she didn't pull away immediately. The warmth of that brief contact lingered longer than it should have, a spark that neither of us commented on, but that both of us felt. It was in these subtle moments that I began noticing her more deeply. The tilt of her head when she was thinking, the quiet strength in her posture, the occasional vulnerability in her eyes that seemed to appear only when she was truly relaxed around me. Every small detail became magnified, and I found myself savoring even the most mundane interactions. Sharing a laugh, exchanging a look that lingered a second too long, or walking silently beside her. All of it carried weight, emotion, and the unspoken acknowledgement that something significant was unfolding between us. Even the silences were meaningful. Sometimes we would sit together, saying nothing, yet feeling profoundly connected. I became aware of her subtle rhythms, how her breathing changed when she was focused, the soft brush of her hair against her shoulder, the warmth radiating from her presence. These quiet observations were more intimate than words, more telling than any confession. By the end of this phase, it was clear that what had begun as curiosity was now something richer, more tender. We weren't yet a couple, and there were no promises made, but the bond forming between us was undeniable. There was trust, attraction, and a slow, inevitable pull towards something deeper, a connection neither of us could ignore. It was subtle, it was human, and it promised a story that was only just beginning to unfold. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day that feels calm and familiar, yet holds the quiet potential for something unexpected. We were sitting on a park bench, the air soft with the scent of early spring flowers, the hum of life around us blending into a gentle backdrop. I had noticed she seemed a little off that day. Her usually poised expression carried a trace of fatigue, her smile lighter than usual, almost hesitant. I didn't press at first. I simply watched, giving her space while my heart quietly urged me closer. Eventually, she began to speak, her voice low, hesitant at first, then gradually steadier as the words found their rhythm. She shared a piece of herself that she rarely revealed, the weight she carried from a past disappointment, the vulnerability hidden beneath her composed exterior. Each word made her seem more human, more real, more profoundly present in a way I hadn't anticipated. I listened carefully, acutely aware of every subtle movement. Her fingers tracing patterns on the edge of her notebook, the small tilt of her head, the way her eyes flicked momentarily to mine before returning to the ground. Without thinking, my hand moved toward hers. The moment our fingers touched, a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the sun or the spring air. Her hand was soft, slightly trembling, and I could feel the subtle pulse of her wrist. She didn't pull away immediately, just let our fingers rest together, a fragile connection suspended in the space between vulnerability and trust. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged with emotion, carrying more meaning than any words could. She shifted closer, resting her cheek lightly against my chest. I felt the gentle rhythm of her heartbeat beneath my shirt, steady but slightly uneven, a mirror of the emotions I was trying to understand and contain. For a moment, time seemed suspended, her warmth against me, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft brush of her hair against my shoulder. I realized, with a mixture of awe and hesitation, that this was more than comfort. This was trust, intimacy, and a silent acknowledgement that our connection had deepened in a way neither of us had planned, nor perhaps fully understood. There was a tension in that moment, quiet but undeniable. I wanted to say something, to reassure her, to reach further, but words felt inadequate, clumsy, unnecessary. Instead, I simply held her there, letting her feel the steadiness of my presence. Her small sigh against my chest spoke volumes, and I felt a mixture of protective instinct and longing, all tangled together. When she finally lifted her head, our eyes met. There was a flicker of something unspoken, acknowledgement, gratitude, perhaps even a quiet desire, but it remained restrained, delicate. Nothing was rushed, nothing forced. And yet, I knew something had shifted. That afternoon, in the soft warmth of spring, with nothing more than a hand held and a cheek resting against the chest, we had crossed an invisible threshold. Something subtle but irrevocable had begun, a slow, careful intimacy that neither of us could, or would, ignore. After that first moment of vulnerability, everything between us became more complex, more charged, and yet more restrained. It wasn't sudden, dramatic, or overtly passionate. It was quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone else. But to me, every glance, every gesture, every pause between words carried weight. The attraction was undeniable, yet both of us seemed caught in the invisible threads of hesitation, social perception, and unspoken rules we weren't entirely ready to defy. I found myself noticing her in ways I hadn't before. The way her hand brushed against mine when passing a pen, the subtle warmth lingering longer than necessary when she leaned slightly closer to hear something I was saying, the quiet way she tilted her head when considering a response. Every gesture pulled me deeper into the complicated web of feelings I didn't fully understand. There was a magnetic tension between us, a delicate balance of desire and restraint, as if both of us were aware of the boundaries we were hesitant to cross, but also keenly aware of how alluringly close we were already standing. Conversations became a dance of honesty and avoidance. We spoke of books, work, or life in general, skimming lightly over topics that might reveal too much, yet sometimes slipping into moments of unexpected openness. She shared insights about her experiences, her thoughts laden with wisdom and subtle vulnerability, and I found myself revealing pieces of myself I rarely showed anyone else. In each exchange, there was an underlying current of what if. What if we allowed ourselves to feel fully, without hesitation? What if we ignored the world's expectations, if only for a moment? Even in silence, the tension persisted. I would catch her eyes lingering on me, just slightly longer than necessary, or feel the warmth of her presence as she moved past me, brushing shoulders almost by accident. Each fleeting contact, fingers grazing, a hand resting briefly on my arm, a shared laugh in close proximity, felt electric. There was comfort, yes, but also the sharp sting of forbidden attraction, the thrilling uncertainty of emotions not yet named aloud. Internal conflict gnawed at me. I admired her confidence and grace, respected her space and boundaries, and yet couldn't deny the desire growing quietly in my chest. Was I imagining things, or did she feel the same? And even if she did, was it right to act on it? These questions clashed with the warmth of our shared moments, leaving me simultaneously exhilarated and anxious. She, too, seemed caught in the same tide of hesitation. There were moments when her eyes softened toward me, lingering with unspoken meaning, yet she would pull back just enough to maintain a careful distance. Her smiles carried both affection and a trace of uncertainty, an acknowledgement of something growing between us, but also a quiet respect for limits unspoken. By the end of this stage, it was clear that neither of us could ignore the pull any longer. Our hearts were aligned in a delicate, conflicted rhythm, wanting closeness, craving intimacy, yet restrained by reason and circumstance. Every brush of hands, every exchanged glance, every shared silence became a quiet battle of desire and restraint, a slow and thrilling tension that promised something deeper if we dared to reach for it. And though we hadn't yet crossed that line, the path was set, a journey of emotional discovery, longing, and tentative courage that neither of us could, or would, turn away from. The moment came unexpectedly, as moments like these often do, not loud, not cinematic, but quietly insistent, demanding acknowledgement. We were walking along a narrow, quiet street just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with soft oranges and pinks. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers and the distant hum of city life. I noticed the way she shivered slightly despite the warmth of the evening, and without thinking, I instinctively reached out to draw her closer. Her body moved into mine, almost imperceptibly, a subtle lean that carried more meaning than words ever could. My hand rested lightly at the small of her back, a gentle pressure that was steady, grounding, and unspoken. She didn't pull away. Instead, her head tilted slightly, brushing against my shoulder, her hair falling soft and fragrant across my chest. The warmth of her body pressed against mine was comforting, grounding, and achingly intimate. It was as if, in that single gesture, all the tension, longing, and uncertainty we had carried for weeks condensed into a quiet, undeniable truth. Her hand found mine, fingers intertwining with a natural ease that felt both thrilling and safe. I could feel the subtle pulse of her heartbeat beneath my palm, a rhythm that seemed to sync with my own. The air between us seemed to hum with unspoken words, feelings too deep for casual conversation, emotions we hadn't yet named aloud. For a moment, we simply stood there, letting the silence speak, letting the closeness itself say what neither of us could yet put into language. She shifted slightly, her cheek resting against my chest, and I felt the faint tremor of her breath, the delicate warmth of her skin, the subtle shiver that spoke of vulnerability and trust. I held her gently, the steadiness of my presence conveying more than words ever could. There was no rush, no pressure, only the quiet acknowledgement that we had reached a point where hesitation was unnecessary. In that moment, I realized that what had been building between us, those fleeting touches, lingering glances, and shared silences, was no longer just anticipation. It was something real, something mutual, something that demanded recognition. I sensed her awareness, too, in the slight squeeze of her hand, in the warmth she allowed me to feel, in the way her eyes closed briefly, trusting me with her unspoken emotions. Time seemed to slow. The world beyond us faded into a soft blur. All that mattered was the quiet connection, the subtle intimacy, the trust and desire interwoven in every gesture. Our hearts, our breaths, our tiny, electric touches, all spoke of a bond that was both fragile and unbreakable. Finally, she lifted her head, our eyes meeting in a silent, mutual understanding. No words were needed. We both knew that this was the point of no return, the emotional climax that validated every subtle touch, every hesitant glance, every unspoken desire that had led us here. It wasn't a rush, a confession, or a dramatic declaration. It was the quiet, undeniable acknowledgement that we belonged, in that moment and perhaps beyond, in each other's hearts. After the quiet intensity of that evening, everything changed. Not in loud, dramatic ways, but in subtle, human moments that felt infinitely more real. The connection we had built over weeks of accidental encounters, shared laughter, and gentle touches had transformed into something tangible, something we both recognized without needing to speak it aloud. The air between us carried a warmth that wasn't just physical, but emotional, as if the world itself had softened around our shared space. We began spending more time together deliberately, not by chance but with intention. Coffee breaks became ritual, walks extended into longer conversations under fading sunlight, and moments of comfortable silence were treasured just as much as words. Every touch was now conscious yet natural. Our fingers intertwined as we walked, hands resting lightly on backs or shoulders when needed, a gentle brush of hair off the cheek, a reassuring squeeze that said more than language ever could. There was a rhythm to these gestures, a quiet understanding that this closeness was mutual, cherished, and unthreatened by haste or expectation. Emotionally, we became mirrors for each other. We shared thoughts, fears, and small joys with a trust that felt rare and precious. When one of us hesitated, the other offered silent reassurance, an unspoken promise that vulnerability would be met with care, not judgment. It was in these tender moments that I understood the depth of what had grown between us. The attraction, which had once been tinged with hesitation and longing, now rested in the steady warmth of companionship, intimacy, and understanding. I remember one particular evening when we sat side by side on a quiet bench overlooking the city lights. The glow from the street lamps reflected softly on her face, highlighting the subtle contours of her expression, confidence tempered with gentle vulnerability. She leaned slightly into me, a natural, effortless gesture, and I rested my arm around her shoulder, careful yet encompassing. Our closeness wasn't urgent. It wasn't desperate. It was deliberate and peaceful, a shared acknowledgement that we had crossed the boundary from longing to belonging. Even when we were apart, the sense of connection lingered. Messages became small reminders of care, fleeting thoughts became quiet smiles, and the anticipation of seeing each other again carried the same gentle thrill as the first accidental encounters. The emotional intimacy we shared was no longer a fragile thread. It had become a steady current running through both our lives. If there were others in her life, friends, confidants, people who mattered, they too found a place in this new rhythm, harmonizing naturally with our bond rather than disrupting it. The story wasn't about secrecy or forbidden attraction anymore. It was about respect, mutual care, and a relationship built slowly, intentionally, and deeply. By the time the story reaches its quiet conclusion, there is no lingering tension, no unresolved longing. Our hands remain entwined, our laughter shared, our silences comfortable, and our hearts aligned. The journey from curiosity to deep connection has been fulfilled, leaving us in a space of trust, warmth, and tender affection, a love that is patient, observant, and profoundly human. It is in these small, lasting moments that the story finds its resolution. A slow-burn romance that blossomed naturally, an age-gap attraction honored with respect, and a quiet, enduring intimacy that feels like home.